In one of many institutional definitions associated with Gordon, again perhaps falsely, is the claim that the university system is little more than an institution in which professionally trained idiots induct other professionally trained idiots into the habits of identifying professionally trained idiocy in their peers. Or, in its shorter iteration, an organization of idiots trained to spot idiots. Undoubtedly simplistic, this definition of university life might nonetheless be added to the Gordonalia. Notoriously, the university bred more than its quota of regurgitative specialists, experts in fossilized vomit, who were said to owe their classificatory terminology to a passing comment Gordon once made. The specialists were stood by a fossil lump they had recently acquired. Having glanced the crinoid stems, all messed up and overlaid, Gordon likened the stone vomit to the so-called cut-up technique. To be classified as vomit, a specimen must contain the stems of at least 2 different species of sea lily, they said, cut up, and mashed about, so that it forms a new text. In a parallel intervention, a research group within the, now defunct, sociology department borrowed its terminology from the paleontologists. Or from Gordon masquerading as a paleontologist. This seems more likely. They had no other contact with the faculty of science at that point, and the university had yet to fully amalgamate. The sociologists found a short tract on Mesozoic deadfalls on a chair Gordon had recently vacated. The typescript was crumpled, so they said, as if Gordon had been sitting on the thing for some time before finally raising himself up and leaving. The sociologists did not much speculate on why Gordon was sitting on the wad of typescript in the first place, and thereby imprinted it, in that manner, with his blunt posterior. They were more struck by the likeness between Gordon's tract and a subsequent publication. This subsequent paper, which they called the derivative paper, would not be published for another 20 or 30 years and would come out under an adjusted title and a long list of authors. None of whom would be Gordon. His own contribution would be erased, as was typical, and the origins of yet another scientific advance in Gordon's own thinking, abstruse as it will have been, were again forgotten. The sociologists who did not quite forget, but struggled in their own way to recall specifics, were reminded in their dotage of Gordon's contribution to science. They remembered Gordon as they later came across the paper in question, and as they passed this recently published report from one retirement home to the next. The paper reminds us of the tract Gordon once left for us to read, and which influenced our thinking at the time, they said. We had recently formed ourselves into a study group and were determined to direct our intelligence at the most pressing problem we faced, the prospect of our own expulsion from the organization and the closure of our department. As they read and reread the script, the sociologists declared their growing certainty that the present paper, the one published in a present journal, did bear sufficient relation to the typescript they originally saw on Gordon's chair. They said it would be possible for them to refashion Gordon's typescript, that they would, indeed should retrospectively construct it with the assistance of this recently published scientific paper. And that they must return themselves to the basics of Gordon's original tract of 2 or 3 decades before. It might have been 4, they said. It could well have been 40 years since Gordon left his tract which influenced us so profoundly at the time, and which we subsequently lost sight of, and then forgot. Their memories had been stimulated by the recent paper, a mere shadow of Gordon's original yet sufficient still to prompt recollection. And they were, as they talked, growing in their resolution, certain of the opinion, relatively so decided, that this version they now recollected, the tract they had read and had been influenced by 20 years earlier, or 30, or more, was an early draft, perhaps the first draft of the present paper. The original draft, Gordon's original, was in many respects magisterial. It may have been the finest and most magisterial tract they had read then or since. And they could confirm, on reflection, that many of its magisterial qualities had been lost in the intervening years, and this was to be expected. The long list of authors in the present paper had none of those magisterial qualities they now recalled as they thought again of the magisterial tract which they had until recently almost entirely forgotten. These subsequent authors of the subsequent paper had, they said, almost entirely overwritten the original tract, or the finer parts of it. Yet enough of that original typescript survived in the debased iteration for them to see and reconstruct in its substance the typescript that Gordon had left behind on his chair. It did not surprise them overly that some of the authors of the subsequent paper were still in little boots at the time these sociologists first read the thing, and that these future authors, the future paleontologists, were unable to hold a spoon, and would not yet shovel food into their mouths when Gordon was then sitting upon, and crumpling, his tract, the first draft, the magisterial original. This eventual paper, the future paper those helpless children would subsequently author after their habit, was even in its lesser qualities also still Gordon's paper. These lesser qualities might be found in its scientific substrate, the elemental reason, the mere bottom scrapings of Gordon's intellect that the paper now represented. These lowest scrapings were all that was left, and this all is what those helpless children eventually published once they had been schooled into becoming paleontologists. These children were not born scientists, they adopted a scientific outlook, or were given one to adopt, and the paper they wrote would be framed in a studiously scientific language. They attempted, yet again, and once more, a deployment of words which aimed for greater precision than words can manage. Those who take pleasure in such things might find it pleasurable to observe how scientific papers remain, to this day, freighted by the language their authors would like to fully instrumentalize. Those who take pleasure might find solace in all the many inexactitudes that even the severest scientific write-up cannot eliminate. The eventual paper dealt, somewhat interminably, as was its style, in the Mesozoic. It was preoccupied with the trace evidence of sunken reptilian corpses about which it had certain important things to communicate. The paper dealt in crocodile-headed, flipper-propelled monsters especially, of the so-called order of the plesiosaurs, to which one or more ichthyosaur deadfall was included, destined for a misspelling or two, here and there. The paper, composed of the substrate of Gordon's mind, a mind that was deprived of its better parts, a brain which had become mere residuum itself, concerned itself then on in, so it goes, with the secondary life these so-called reptilian deadfalls would spawn on the ocean floor once they reached that base. It seemed more than likely that these reptilian deadfalls produced islands of corpse life, and these islands of corpse life became fossilized too, and so entered the fossil register alongside the greater sea lizard that was the cause of their abundance. The sunken monsters produced these islands once they landed in the deeper parts of a Mesozoic sea, here or there settling in position either on their left flank or right-hand side, from which position, on the left or right side, they would wait for the first seafloor scavengers to approach and maul them over. The authors of the paper always wished to determine which side it was, first of all, before moving to a detailed description of other particulars. Was it laid on its left side before fossilization, or its right side? This was first determined and first stated. It was a matter for the opening paragraph of each respective deadfall report to report. The authors would first communicate to the reader the left or right particulars, and this would be the paragraph to contain it. The seafloor scavengers minded themselves not which it was, and mauled over the sunken monster from whichever flank was most available, and then from inside out. Eventually, after the carcass of some Mesozoic reptilian monster or other had gone through inevitable and considerable manipulation and consumption by mobile communities of tentacular and finned creatures, and then the further manipulations of rooted communities of the anchor-extending and grasping order of creatures, and, finally, the gentle intrusions of microbial life, all of which left the bones somewhat dispersed and strewn, the Mesozoic sea floor slowly grew upward around these final picked-over remains. It rose by sedimental increments far slower than in shallower waters. These would be the meager but sufficient necessities of fossilization. Each deadfall disappeared in this way, under a gentle pelagic rain. Naturally, this pelagic setting was not at all the preoccupation of the sociology research group. Nor were they interested in so-called deep time. Sociologists need not think at all about the many millions of years which precede them. But they found the alien terminology useful, so they said, and related to the extraordinary pressures of the deep sea, feeling under extraordinary pressure themselves. Theirs was a setting, moreover, which was filled with relatable life forms or human habits which were all teeth and lures. They used similar terminology, deadfalls, seafloor scavengers, sunken monsters, and so on, but to examine the coming death of institutions modeled after their own. Their dismemberment might be thought about in similar terms, just as they might think of institutions that had already fallen before them. We were working within a living corpse, the sociologist said. Our institution had become a corpse and we needed a way to conceptualize the corpse life we were already confined to, back then, and which has only become worse since our retirement. We thought we were in one of its dead spaces, they continued, everything around us seemingly already dead, but we could not ignore our own continued movements in the dead space of the university and the movements of others, and so needed a way of thinking how a dead space, or a space of death, or a still living space which felt heavy with death, might still be alive, even profligate at times. And when we saw our professors dance as professors now dance, we needed a way of understanding that. Gordon had already anticipated this need for a conceptualization device, and Gordon prefigured as an after effect of his thinking certain advances in paleontology too, they said. Paleontology only benefited, as it did, by an accidental effect of the conceptualization device that Gordon clearly bequeathed us and that Gordon intended for us, so that we could understand why we felt heavy with death, and why the professors still danced. Gordon gave us this conceptualization device as Gordon stood from his chair and left that crumpled remainder which was its manner of conveyance. Some of the fossilized monsters mentioned in that other paper, the subsequent paper, had not even been discovered when Gordon raised himself from his chair. As he raised himself up with the crumpled tract remaining where he sat, that typescript already described those monsters and other monsters too. These particular fossilized monsters that the paleontologists later described were still undisturbed in their limestone tombs when our research group first assembled and read Gordon's piece. They had not been chiseled out of their Italian quarry. And their contemporary whale analogues lay undisturbed too. These whale fall events of our own time were still as yet entirely unglimpsed, having fallen dead and unobserved like all other large cetacean-sized corpses have fallen and lain unobserved for millions of years. And yet, Gordon provided the conceptual apparatus to regard these discoveries in terms of their particulars. Gordon supplied a way of thinking contemporary corpse life just as he supplied a way of thinking Mesozoic corpse life, having figured fathoms deep deadfall events before the first submarine to find the first deadfall whale did indeed find that whale. This whale was the first known corpse descender, run across by mere accident at 4,000 feet, or 666 fathoms, in the late 80s. As the biologists of the day described with more enthusiasm than allowed by their scientific credentials, 2,000 years of ordinary oceanic snow would be needed to fill the same patch of seabed with the same nutriment that a 40-ton whale might deliver in a moment. At 4,000 feet, the 40-ton monster lay, and this 40-ton monster represented a feast, and that feast would last 50 years, perhaps 80. There might be some eating to do around that carcass in a century or more, why not? It was a gift to the seabed, and all the crawling creatures, and the swimmers too, coming from distances that could be crawled, or drifted, or swam, would assemble, and had assembled, and had already nibbled a good amount, and would keep nibbling and tearing at and infesting the tissues for so much longer than we have the resources to watch. We do not have the resources to watch, the biologists already lamented. These biologists envisaged how the eager creatures gathered from the murk, hauled in by water-scented aromas of necrotic tissue, and then succeeded one another in waves of rampant breeding and eating as they scavenged for the corpse goodness, and how the corpses were profuse with living things, ending in the incrustation of deep-sea anemones and filter-feeding tube worms that seemed to gesture with them like flags from the ramparts of ribcage and vertebra. We shall need greater funds, they said as the submarine returned to the surface. We shall need millions so that we can keep returning to that corpse to witness its disintegration and nutriment effects. Gordon had already as good as seen the crawling and the infesting and the tearing to pieces, or if he had not quite seen these precise creatures or would not know them if he did, Gordon would have seen by intuition how the corpse life would conduct itself, and how the death of large things must be followed through by the littler things that live in and around them, and then by the slightly bigger things, the human seeing things and their verbal engines, which would deploy little phrases like flags from the ramparts, and other such trivia. So it was Gordon provided the conceptual apparatus to conceptualize this deadfall environment before anyone had studied or even glimpsed these sunken whales in his time. And, in any case, by the time they glimpsed them, most of the deadfall environment these biologists had just discovered and made available to science was itself dead. The scavengers had largely become extinct beyond what would become a few usual suspects, gathering to nibble, and this due to decades of whaling and the eventual introduction of factory ships that would drag the entire carcass on board and process the thing in its entirety. The entire deadfall event and its ecological explosion became uncommon. Ocean floors dotted with dead whales across their migration routes grew rare, and the species that preyed upon them grew rarer too. Many presumably died out long before these agents of science arrived, in what was, most probably, the first deep-sea extinction event caused by humans. A whole cluster of extinctions in the uglier order of species had already long passed. The extinction of these uglier lifeforms, carcass specialists evolved over millions of years, was as certain, these scientists now felt, as it had to remain a matter of pure speculation. They imagined carpets of worm life waving their fronds from the ramparts, only these carpets were not red but blue, and their blood was not iron-rich but copper-made. These blue carpets of worm fronds could no longer gain purchase, they no longer existed to gain purchase at the time the first submarines were launched that went looking for deadfall islands. When the millions were sought to launch those submarines, to buy them, or have them built, much of the corpse life they were funded to discover was already gone, as Gordon might have already told them, or as they might have seen from a close reading of the more speculative passages in the tract left on his chair, those which dealt not merely with deadfall events, but with the death of most species which would attend those events. This was all of it in the tract too, the sociologist said. Gordon anticipated all of that, and we would have known it too, they admitted, had we known how to read the typescript as we read it now, in retrospect, as we remember it. That is to say, Gordon anticipated both the Mesozoic deadfall and the contemporary deadfall, and then the virtual extinction of most deadfall specialist scavengers that had been picking over corpses for millions of years, and the bone suckers and bone borers, specialist mollusks and other worms, bone dust-eating snails, and novel species of tube worm like those still remaining, those with no mouth or gut and which bore holes in whale bones and digest their lipids with the help of bacteria attached to their lower root-like appendages. These grasp around and into their purchase points, and so eat them. When it came to corpse life, Gordon anticipated its human attendants too. We should have known them in their particulars before they took their particulars on or became them, the sociologist said. In human communities, bit piece pickers might have similarly ancient precursors and similarly ugly habits, and with each civilizational collapse these specialists in dismemberment might have returned to the heights of their activity, and there may, indeed, be an untold history of these institutional disassemblers, and the complex systems of colonization and metabolization they spawned. The use of stone from a Roman villa in a medieval church is really nothing but a trace of their work. That the same limestone used to build these Roman villas was subsequently quarried 2,000 years later by geologists whose findings were presented in the paper on Mesozoic deadfalls, is nothing but an indicator of a shared greed, differently manifested. Our own corpse life is not particularly distinct, they said, thinking of the ruins of their university, or if it is different, it might owe many of its activities to older habits acquired over the deadfall events of historic time. The opportunistic, crab-like movements of colleagues at work may be ancient reflexes, distantly acquired motions, which merely required the right conditions to re-emerge and would only appear, with such preponderance, in events such as this. The corpse life of a present-day university worker may well reinvest the habits of past bit piece pickers from past civilizational collapses, and the modern university might merely be the latest corpse. To them, or from the perspective of their genomic inheritance. The sociologists in question recognize that during its 900-year emergence from medieval to modern institution, with medieval vestiges and vestments, the university had accumulated a considerable legacy of material, nutriments of a sort, and these would produce mass spawn events in the years of its final decay and decomposition. The successions would be diverse in their taxonomic composition and would represent islands of activity and abundance at their high points. Each spawn would be a simulation of intellectual ferment, they felt, and could be nothing more in the dead zone it would inhabit. The professors would do their dance, but it would merely be another spawn event, and another exhibit of corpse life. These occasional upsurges which resembled intellectual activity without being remotely intellectual, would occur in the midst of desert space, the city space, in the district of wider intellectual dead zones which were to fall or had already descended upon the city and city life and its attendant media, both printed and electrified, or in the context of that dead zone one theorist among them called, the stupefaction of public life. Or so much the sociology research group claimed. Having no investment themselves in the city and the city life they presumed dead. These sociologists merely grazed in its superior coffee houses and disregarded the rest. They had no real knowledge of its thinking life and thinking health, and assumed, probably not without purchase on reality, that the thinking life of the city was just as dead, or ailing, as the thinking life of its university, and so they condemned it too. Their outlook would have been considered bold at the time, although their analysis has since come to appear obvious as it relates to the death of so-called higher education which is now laid fairly low. Their university had already spent years in the pre-deadfall phase, the floating and bloating period, during which multiple surface-level scavengers had nibbled and distended its corpse. In its bloating years, weaker anatomical units, fins, heads, tails, became detached and drifted away just as various parasites attempted to anchor themselves on and affix themselves into the blubber. The weaker anatomical units of the original corpse, those parts released in the initial phase of corpse life, these might become deadfalls too, but they would descend far from the main body and would produce less active zones of decay and dismemberment. They fell elsewhere in the city and vanished quickly. The university then and thereafter, or the residual bulk of it, took the form or the habits of a large sunken carcass, a reeking lump in the middle of an otherwise dead cityscape of deadened living. There were still little upsurges of necrotic-driven activity to be had and to delight in, residual and derivative as they might nonetheless be. Mobile scavenging communities, such as they hoped to become, might only hope to stray to another corpse in a slightly better condition. If they could make it through the community of bit piece pickers, the other corpse would have likely already assembled. So much for their analogy, which was their terminology. The research group soon dispersed. Evidently, the sociologists required further impetus to turn the little script Gordon left on his chair into an operational variable, and this impetus was never forthcoming.